What is up, guys? Welcome back to Core CSS Mastery. We're going to be talking about position. The position property in CSS is very powerful, very useful, and it can be a great way of enhancing our layout to be exactly how we want it to appear. However, if we don't understand how layout works, it can seem quite complex. So this is a fairly important topic in CSS. If you understand position, you're going to do well. If you find the topic tricky or you don't understand it, you're going to have to deal with a number of headaches along the way, wondering why elements aren't appearing where you think they should be. When we talk about position, there are 4 properties we can apply to an element. We have relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky. We also have offset values which we can apply on those elements, which changes their position. And these properties are top, right, bottom, and left. So let's start with relative because it's probably the most straightforward of all of the positions. Now, what do we have here on our HTML page? We have a navbar. We have 3 divs with some width and height styling, but different colors set to their background. So those are toggled with the classes red, green, and blue. And we've just changed the background color on those divs based on whether the class name is red, green, or blue. We also have a few different paragraphs of text at the bottom of the document. Let's start by styling that red div. So we'll find the CSS selector for the class of red, going to add a position property, and we're going to set the value to relative. Now notice that when I refresh the page, nothing happens. So the relative value leaves an element where it is in the normal flow of the page. So if that's the case, what's the purpose of setting position relative? Well, we can now make use of those offset values. So for example, if we set top 100 pixels, let's have a look at what happens to our red element. It's now 100 pixels away from the top of where it would have been previously. We can do the same thing for bottom. And what this actually does is push the element off the top of the viewport, because the bottom of the element is now 100 pixels relative to where it would have been originally. Now, one thing we might ask at this point is, why don't we just set a margin? For example, we can set top 100 pixels. Sure, it brings the element down 100 pixels. We get that, but can't we just do that with margin top? Well, let's just try that. Notice the difference. If I set margin top 100 pixels, let's refresh the page. So notice everything else on the page gets shifted downwards because they also have to respect that margin. So the difference with position relative is that the rest of the page still behaves like that element is in its original position. But we as the end user can see the position of that element offset by the various values we provide. So position relative with the top of 100 pixels is not the same as setting a margin top of 100 pixels because the margin pushes the rest of the page down. So for example, we could actually set something like a top of 500 pixels, and notice that red element appears all the way down the page, below the green div and below the blue div. However, the space where the red div would originally be is still reserved by the browser. The browser is pretending that that red div is still in that location where it was originally. It's just showing us that div offset by 500 pixels. By the way, we can also use the values left and right. For example, if we set left 0 pixels, the element is where it would be originally. If we set an offset of 200 pixels on the left, you'll see it moves 200 pixels away from the left. We can also set a negative value if we want to. We could, of course, just use right along with an offset value if we wanted to move the element left also. Let's move on now to our next position property, which is going to be fixed. Notice we have a navbar at the top of our page, so the user can click links and navigate through the site. If we scroll down the page, notice, however, that we can't see the navbar. And it's fairly logical, the navbar's at the top of the page, so if we scroll down the page, we're not going to be able to continue to see the navbar. Now, this is okay functionality. Many sites are set up like this. The user is required to scroll back to the top if they want to make use of the navigation links. There's nothing wrong with this. But what if we wanted the user to be able to still see the navbar no matter where they scrolled on the screen? Well, for this, we can use the position fixed. So we have our nav element here. Let's set position fixed. Let's refresh the page. Now just ignore that red div momentarily. It's obviously behaving a little bit strangely. Let's have a look at our navbar now. As we scroll down the page, that navbar stays where it is at the top of the viewport. That's because when we use position fixed, first of all, it removes the navbar from the regular flow of the page. So that navbar basically exists in a different dimension now to the rest of the page. And that fixed property allows us to specify a location for an element relative to the viewport. So no matter where we scroll on the page, if an element is fixed to the top of the viewport, it's always going to appear at the top of the viewport. Now let's return to that red div. We appear to have the top cut off our red div. So what's going on there? This was fine before we set position fixed on the nav. So why is it suddenly moved up and is being cut off by the navbar? Well, remember how we said the nav now exists in a different dimension. It's removed from the regular flow of the page. That red div is now acting like the navbar is not really there, and it's moving to the top of the page because it's now the first element on the page. And we know that block elements always try and occupy the next available vertical space. So it's moved up. Now that creates a problem for us because now it's concealed beneath the navbar. We don't want that. We don't want the top part of our content being cut off by a fixed element. So what is the solution? Well, one thing we could do is simply move the content down so that it's not covered by the navbar. And there are a couple of ways of achieving this. The really basic way is simply to add some BRs to our HTML document. If we refresh the page, everything moves down. This is a perfectly okay solution, but we might think it's not very elegant. In fact, a lot of developers don't really make use of BRs. There's nothing wrong with them, but now we have this skill set where we work with CSS, we can actually achieve a lot of these things using CSS. For example, let's try setting a margin top on the red div, and let's see what happens. So we'll set margin top. Let's move it down by 100 pixels to try and create some space. Now it did move the red div down, but it's also moved the nav down. So that's not quite what we intended. Let's take a quick look at the dev tools and see what's happening here. So the margin on the red div is causing the nav bar to move downwards. Now this might seem strange, but also it just illustrates that it's really good to make use of offset values for the fixed position. This is actually a really easy fix. Taking a look at that nav styling, we set position fixed, but we didn't specify any kind of offset. We didn't give instructions to the CSS regarding where that nav should appear. So the nav was essentially trying to appear in its default position, but staying fixed to that position. The problem is, as we can see, it's also respecting margins, and that's causing its default position to come down the page, which we don't want. However, we can simply set top 0 pixels. Now we've been very explicit and told the browser exactly where we want that element to appear. Now our navbar is at the top of the page. None of the content is being concealed. When we scroll, our navbar stays at the top of the viewport. So let's move on now to position sticky. This is actually very similar to fixed, but the idea here is the element only becomes fixed at a certain point, and it's related to any kind of element that has a scroll. So we're going to set position sticky on the red div, but we need to provide a point in the viewport where it's going to stick to if it scrolls past that point. Now, just looking at our nav here, we can get an idea because the height of our nav is 40 pixels. So let's set top 40 pixels on that red div. So what will happen here is that red div will scroll like normal. However, when it reaches the location in the viewport, which we've specified, so 40 pixels from the top of the viewport, it will now start behaving like a fixed element. So we scroll, the red div moves, but notice how it just attaches itself to the top of the navbar and starts behaving like a fixed element from that point onwards. Now, similar to position fixed, we can also use position sticky on navbars. So let's set position sticky on the navbar. Now, one advantage to position sticky over position fixed is that position sticky keeps that navbar within the normal flow of the page. So we don't actually need to specify a margin top now on that red element. Of course, with navbars, they usually start at the top of the page anyway. So unlike what we did with the red div, this navbar is going to be immediately sticky from the outset. That's because it has an offset of top 0 pixels. In fact, the only difference here between position sticky and position fixed is that in this case with position sticky, that navbar retains its place as part of the normal flow of the document. So if I remove the margin top now on the red element, we can see we still have room for all of the content, and we basically have a fixed navbar which occupies its normal place on the page. Let's just say for argument's sake that for whatever reason our nav began 300 pixels below the top of the page. Let's set margin top 300 pixels. I suppose you might do this if you had some kind of header content and then you had your navigation links below the top of the page. When we scroll, notice that nav sticks to the top of the page when it gets to top 0 pixels. Now it starts behaving like a fixed element. We scroll back up, you can see the navbar now returns to its original location as part of the standard flow of the page. By the way, another application of fixed, if we just return the navbar to fixed, is we could actually specify bottom 0 pixels. And we now have a footer which sticks to the bottom of the viewport as well. So now we move on to our last of the position properties, and this is position absolute. This is probably the most confusing of the four, but if you followed everything so far, probably won't be too much of an issue. Position positions an element relative to its nearest positioned ancestor. So what is a positioned ancestor? It's an element that doesn't have the position value of static. Static is just the default position value for elements. So we could, of course, set an element to position static, but it wouldn't actually change the element because by default, it has position static. Now, the best example of this is to create a relative and absolute container pair. You'll see how this works. Let's pick one of our divs. Let's take our red div and we'll give it position relative. Let's also increase the size of that container. So we'll set width to 400 pixels and we'll set height to 400 pixels. Let's refresh our page. We'll also just remove that margin on our nav as well. Okay, so we have a large container with position relative. What we'll do next is we'll take our blue container and we're going to paste it inside our red container. We'll just get rid of our text as well in the containers, just so we have plain containers. Okay, makes sense. We have a blue div inside of the red div. At the moment, that blue div has margin left auto. That's why it's appearing over on the right. So this is the default layout. We have one div inside another div. So what we can do here is set a position absolute on that blue div. We can then position it relative to the red div. And that's because the red div is a positioned ancestor. It doesn't have position static. It has position relative. So it's the closest positioned ancestor. So let's try position absolute on the blue div. Let's refresh the page. Nothing happens at this stage. That's because we need to provide some offset values. So now if I provide right 0 pixels, so what we're saying here is this is the offset from the right side of the parent element. We refresh, we can see that the blue div moves 0 pixels away from the right hand side of the red element. If we set 20 pixels, it's going to be 20 pixels away from the right hand side of its nearest positioned ancestor, the red div. And we can of course set multiple values here. So we could set top 100 pixels. Now, since we're here, let's just touch on a small feature of the mechanics of how this works. So let's set right to 0 pixels. You can see there that it touches the edge of the red div. What if I were to set right to minus 20 pixels? What will happen? The blue div protrudes now from the edge of the red container. It's still positioned relative to the red container, but that doesn't mean it has to be inside the red container in terms of how we see it. Now notice we're using a negative value here. So here's something to think about. Is right minus 20 the same as left plus 20? Take a moment and think before we do this. So left means it's 20 pixels away from the left-hand side of the nearest positioned ancestor. Minus 20 obviously means it's now going to appear protruding outside the left-hand side of the element. Same with top and bottom. If we had, for example, a negative value for top, for example, minus 50 pixels, that element is now going to protrude outside the top of the red div. You can also set bottom 0 pixels if you want to set that element to the bottom of the red div. Well, it's nearly at the bottom, right? So what's happening here? Well, we actually have a margin bottom of 10 pixels on the container. So that blue div is at the bottom of the red div, but it's still inside the margins. So if we remove margin bottom, We can now see the blue div touches the bottom of the red div. And of course, if we use a negative value for bottom, it's now going to protrude out the bottom of the red div. Now, one final thing to try. What if that red div wasn't the nearest positioned ancestor? Let's get rid of position relative on the red div. So if we don't have a nearest positioned ancestor, then that absolute position is based on the initial container, the initial viewport. In fact, I've just changed bottom to 0 pixels, so it's a bit more straightforward. So why do we say the initial viewport? Why not just the viewport? Well, if I scroll down, you can see that element actually stays in its location. So it's based around that initial viewport, but when we scroll, it doesn't stay stuck to the bottom left, as in the case of being a fixed element, for example. So this is more or less everything you need to know. This is a very powerful and important concept in CSS. So make sure you know this specific aspect of CSS inside out. It's going to be very useful for you as you continue to write good CSS. All right, thanks very much for watching, guys. Catch you in the next part of the course.